I want to welcome you to a forum with OPD and the Daviess County Sheriff's Department on substance abuse or drugs in Owensboro and Daviess County and what's going on. We're going to talk about what's going on, what we are trying to accomplish, what we are haven't been able to accomplish, how substance abuse, illicit drugs, and alcohol are affecting the folks here in our community. And this morning, as have said, I have Sheriff Keith Cain
Good to be here,
with the
Judge.
Daviess
Thank you.
County Sheriff's Department and Major J.D. Winkler from Owensboro Police Department.
Glad to be here, sir.
It's nice to have both of you here. You actually are inaugurating the brand new, newly remodeled courtroom and electronic system. So we're kind of doing, you guys are on a test run with me this morning. So if you feel comfortable, since we're socially distanced here in the courtroom, you can remove your mask. That's what I'm going to do. If you don't, you can keep the mask on. Being that I'm an old dude, I've had both of my shots. So Jordan Rowe is in the back. He's operating the cameras. And if you folks would have any questions that you might want us to address, if we can, send a email or a text or however Jordan wants you to comment on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and we'll try to address that. He'll get it to me on my text messages here on my phone. So let's get started. Sheriff, let's talk about the scope of the problem here in Owensboro and Daviess County. Just how widespread is the illicit drugs, the substance abuse? You know, we hear about heroin, we hear about meth, but we have a real pain pill problem as well. So tell us about the problem. How widespread is it?
Sure. It's important to realize, Judge, that I've been in law enforcement here in Daviess County with the Sheriff's Office for about 4.5 decades now. We were combating this problem when I started, and we continue to combat it today. And it's very easy to lose heart and feel like we're not really making any progress. But in fact, much progress has been made. If you look at it in terms of the people that have been helped in overcoming substance use, have turned their life around, the quantities of drugs that are seized by the police department and the sheriff's department, the laws that have been passed to assist us in this endeavor. There are a lot of success stories along the way, but it's very easy to get lost in the fact that there's so much still needs to be done. So the short answer to your question, one that I'm not known for, is we continue to work diligently. All of the police agencies, the Kentucky State Police, Owensboro Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, collectively, and that's important. And I'll let Major Winkler address some of the issues that we've done in terms of working collectively. But we continue to work diligently, but it's a never-ending fight. Two, you can't view anything relative to society and its current situation without viewing the COVID pandemic and how that has impacted what we do in terms of law enforcement and substance abuse. COVID-19, the pandemic strained the pre-existing resources and staffing of law enforcement agencies. That's certainly true with mine. I know it is with OPD also. Then you take into considerations there are people out there, unfortunately, that are struggling. Some have lost their jobs. Those individuals that may have been occasional drug users, unfortunately, transition to a more habitual use of controlled substances. And even in some instances that we have encountered, where those people have transitioned to low-level drug trafficking. So it's worsened the problem. Our deputies and our officers had more contacts in terms of dealing with those that are mentally ill, including substance abuse and depression. Our deputies in 2019 filled out 109 e-crisis reports. That's when they encounter these individuals. That number jumped to 139 during the pandemic in 2020. And suicides, the suicide rate increased, unfortunately, during 2020. I know we worked some 13 of those, I think, in 19. That jumped to close to 20 in 2020. So some of those, certainly not all of them, but some of those had a drug nexus. So, you can view this from a position that you prefer to. It's bad and getting worse, and there's nothing we can do about it. I prefer not to take that position. I'm an individual that tends to view obstacles as opportunities, and we continue to fight the good fight. In terms of drugs of abuse, you mentioned that. Methamphetamine undoubtedly continues to be the #1 drug of choice, and not only in Owensboro, Daviess County, but in Western Kentucky. But there are success stories even in view of that. My dad used to always say that every dark cloud had a silver lining. He was, again, one of these optimistic individuals. And when we first started dealing with meth, which was termed the meth epidemic about 1999, just about the time that I took over as sheriff here in Daviess County. I dislike that term epidemic because it's indicative of a problem that's spiraling out of control, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, we did do something about it. The local production of methamphetamine, which impacted Western Kentucky and Daviess County in 99, peaked some 10 or 11 years later in 2011, when we were seizing right at about 1,400 labs across the Commonwealth. There was a time in the early days of the clandestine manufacturing of methamphetamine in Kentucky that Owensboro Daviess County was ground zero. We were working 8 to 10 of these labs a week. Many times we were working multiple labs a day. And there were those that said, the naysayers, that, well, this is a problem, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, we did do something about it. And I can tell you that in 2019, that those numbers dropped from a peak in 2017 to almost over 1,400 labs to 10 labs throughout the entire Commonwealth. We essentially put them out of business. That's a home run for law enforcement and for the community, because the hazards we were dealing with on the front end of production, those labs were unstable, they were explosive, they were toxic, and our officers and our community, our laypersons, were encountering these labs. We basically put them out of production, but the meth problem continued, because what quickly moved in to fill the void, as we anticipated it would, is high quality, abundant, and as a result of the availability, cheap methamphetamine originating from south of the border, made its way across the heartland into Daviess County, and it continues to be a major problem. Certainly the #1 drug of choice. You indicated the issue with heroin. Heroin was virtually non-existent here when I worked dope back in the 80s. But we do see it now, and of course, the real evil looming on the horizon right now is fentanyl, but we'll get into that a little later.
Okay. Major, again, welcome here, and kind of segueing into what the sheriff was talking about, as the number of arrests for manufacturing meth here locally started down, we started seeing an increase for arrests in trafficking in methamphetamine. And I know we can't say a lot about a major bust that occurred a couple months ago, or at the first of the year. There was a huge amount of methamphetamine, 151 pounds, I think.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I got the numbers written down over here, but yeah, we was knocking on. There was some secondary sources that tied in with that. That number will go up as we continue to investigate and continue to get it. But that's
Okay.
part of it.
So I think one of the things that we forget about is that probably the #1 drug that we deal with is alcohol. Alcohol causes a lot of issues, family problems, and have we seen an increase in DUIs and alcohol abuse arrests for public intoxication over the last 12 months as a result of the pandemic?
In general, the majority of crimes have stayed pretty static, especially those. It's when it comes to addiction type, whether it be drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, there's an argument to be made that it's not necessarily a criminal justice problem. So our go-to is to provide medical assistance for those if possible. So has COVID created a problem? Absolutely. I think it's created some opportunities for some individuals to come in, and that is kind of the stuff that led to the drug bust a couple months ago. Addiction, when it comes to the social isolation that we're facing now, it has the ability. People are just not as exposed to many people. There's not you don't have that those family encounters, the friends that are around, and the opportunities for them to notice things and intervene or slow that down. So absolutely, that has become a problem or been, I guess, magnified due to COVID. But it's a problem that I know, and I'll kind of touch. The sheriff covered a lot of it, but I think the number one thing when it comes to our drug problem, the most popular misconception is that, well, it's only certain parts of the community. Trust me.
Thank you.
It absolutely touches every portion of this community. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you live in. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter your education or your occupation. It touches all of us. And that includes law enforcement, lawyers, doctors, you name it. We all have someone close to us that's battling addiction. So it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
Major, thank you for bringing that up. That was on my next statement that I was going to make. It doesn't matter where you live. This touches you. It doesn't matter how old you are. You know, a lot of people think it's young folks who are into this. It doesn't really matter. I tell the story about my brother David, who's in his mid-40s. This was back when manufacturing was the way you got methamphetamine, and he was arrested, thank God, by the sheriff's department here in Daviess County. Spent 3 months in the Daviess County jail, and then he had a come to meet Jesus moment. He called me and said, well, I'm ready to get help, and we were able to get him out, take him to up to Louisville, Wayside Mission in Louisville for a year. He came back. Mike Griffith was a judge at the time and sentenced him to another year up there. And my brother's passed on, but the last 4 or 5 years of his life were the best 4 or 5 years of his life because he spent them counseling those folks who had gone through the same things that he had done. And I think sometimes the best counselors that we have, the best people, the best advocates for folks who are hooked on drugs, who have an addiction problem, are those people who have come through and beat the problem themselves. So it can be done. And I want everybody that's watching this to understand that sometimes thinking that we're doing our friends and our relatives a favor, all we're doing is enabling them to continue the substance abuse. And as my mom and I discussed the day that David appeared before Judge Castlin, I had the money to bail him out at the time. And the discussion was, if we bail him out, one of two things will happen. He will either kill himself or, heaven forbid, kill somebody else. And we left him there, and as I said. So anyway, marijuana, everybody think, you know, there's all the law or efforts to pass a medical marijuana bill, medical marijuana legislation. And I absolutely support medical marijuana as long as it's proven to be effective in treatment and safe in treatment, and that it's gone through the same steps as drugs, other drugs have gone through the FDA trials. Sheriff, it seems to me, though, there always is accompanying medical marijuana bill to a bill that would legalize the sale across the board.
Well, there certainly are efforts and have been before, not only the Kentucky legislature, but throughout the country. I think now there's 38 states that have passed some type of relaxed marijuana legislation, whether that be recreational, decriminalized, legalization, or whatever. So, yeah, there has been and there is a bill before the Kentucky legislature right now to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. But that's an issue that should be reserved by itself, certainly shouldn't be applicable to what we're looking at in terms of medicinal or a therapeutic value of marijuana. You know, Judge, I've looked at this issue pretty extensively over a period of the last 5 or 6 years, and I can tell you that my position on it has changed somewhat. Initially, if you look at where I've been quoted in terms of the medical value of marijuana, if you go back 5, 6, 7 years, you'll see that I echoed what basically law enforcement was saying throughout the country, and that was, no, this is bad. It's bad because it's always bad, and it's bad because law enforcement says it's bad. And you know, the days of people taking law enforcement's word at face value are long gone and forgotten, and probably should be, just to be honest with you. But at any rate, in looking at the medicinal value of marijuana, I have the honor and the privilege of chairing the National Sheriff's Association's Drug Enforcement Committee, and I can tell you we took this on back in 2018. We had a resolution with the National Sheriff's Association at that time, which basically said, again, that we were against all things marijuana. And that resolution was getting ready to expire in 2019. So we thought it incumbent upon us to get down into the weeds of this and to see what validity there was to this discussion of medical marijuana. So we spent the better part of 1.5 years looking at it. We spoke with individuals on both sides of the issue, very spirited discussions, and ultimately we amended our resolution to basically say this, and I'm paraphrasing obviously. We recognize, we meaning the National Sheriff's Association, I will tell you that that resolution has been mimicked by the Kentucky Sheriff's Association, is that we recognize the potential, and I'm choosing my words very carefully here, the potential of the medicinal and therapeutic value of marijuana. However, we believe that lies in the exploitation of the cannabinoids in marijuana, that is the chemical compounds in marijuana. Now then, to what extent that is, we really don't know, because there's the research, their research, statutory, regulatory research barriers, because marijuana is currently classified on the under the Federal Controlled Substance Act as a Schedule I drug. Now then, a Schedule I drug is a drug that, number one, has no medicinal value and has a high potential for abuse. Drugs such as LSD, mescaline, things of that nature. Marijuana has been in that since the Controlled Substance Act was passed in 1968. We believe, recognizing that there is a potential value of marijuana, a medicinal value of marijuana, that marijuana should be deregulated to a Schedule II, drugs that have a recognized medicinal value and a high potential for abuse, which are the majority of the drugs that we deal with today. Now, that I can tell you, that's been met with a lot of opposition from many of my peers in law enforcement. However, we think that the research that is needed to qualify just exactly to what extent marijuana is a value as medicine should be looked into. And that money is not available for that research as long as marijuana is classified as a Schedule I. By regulating it to a Schedule II, that would open up the research that is needed. You know, if you listen to, and I have, the countless individuals that testify that marijuana has had a therapeutic value on whatever malady they have. And there are many of these people here in our home state of Kentucky. But unfortunately, that is anecdotal information. It's not based on research. I have no doubt what these people testify to and say is true, but it's anecdotal. And I believe that we believe that to answer the questions of not only the medicinal value, but also that research would quantify the impairment levels of marijuana to the consumer. All these questions need to be answered. We don't believe that marijuana ought to be regulated as medicine by popular vote. We believe that it ought to follow the same scrutiny of all other medicine. There's been no other medicine It's been regulated as such by popular vote. We believe that should go through the FDA. Now then, that having been said, let me close with this because it's important that our constituency hear it, and it's important to me. I recognize that marijuana, the potential value of marijuana, will aid the sick and the suffering. Many of those are children, I have found out. It will help, it could help, and has helped to some degree, our combat veterans that are coming back, assimilating back into society. And also the terminally ill, to help with leaving this world with some sense of dignity. I recognize that all of those individuals are deserving of the answers this research would bring, so that once and for all, we could quantify to what extent marijuana is of value as medicine.
I think what I hear you saying, Sheriff, is let's get the research done.
Absolutely.
Let's get the research done. Major, when we're talking about marijuana, back several years ago, synthetic marijuana made its appearance. And I forget what they called it, all different types of smoking spices and those kinds of things. And we have a local organization. It's the Owensboro Daviess County Alliance Against Substance Abuse. And we were very successful in lobbying the General Assembly in passing legislation which controlled synthetic marijuana. One of the things about synthetic marijuana, though, is it was readily available, it seemed, through various markets. But one of the things I heard about it was that folks who had an adverse reaction to synthetic marijuana really became difficult to handle. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, the primary problem with synthetic marijuana is you didn't know what chemical composition it had. People didn't know what they was smoking, and I mean that's with any black market drug, whether it be marijuana or fentanyl or heroin or whatever, that's the case. And the sheriff was discussing marijuana being a Schedule I, and I think that kind of leads us into what our problem is with marijuana and the addiction issue. And it's always, when I was growing up, it was always marijuana as a gateway drug. I believe that alcohol is just as much of a gateway drug as what marijuana is. When you look at it from the way that when we were teaching our kids, or when we were teaching people, we categorized marijuana the same as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, we're creating a problem. And that's because it's a gateway drug, not because it leads from one thing to the next. From the addicts that I talked to working narcotics over the years, the majority of them, they would smoke marijuana. It wasn't as bad as what their parents had told them. And so they assumed that cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine was the same. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need to educate our children and educate people and say that marijuana is a good thing to smoke it or alcohol or anything. But we do need to teach the difference and be realistic about the dangers that are associated with it. Otherwise, we will we'll undermine our authority, I guess, is the best way to do it if we're not presenting the facts as they exist. There's a difference between marijuana and heroin. Doesn't mean that marijuana is safe, but that leads you into the problems if you don't know what marijuana has been laced with. You don't know what you're taking. So I think that all kind of ties in together of us when it comes to our education approach to young people as they're coming up, that we need to think about that. We need to keep that in the front of our minds.
Judge?
Yes, sir.
The Major makes an excellent point. I think we in law enforcement have done ourselves a disservice over the years in terms of just exactly of what he's talking about. Education, absolutely. But misinformation can be very, very dangerous. And I can recall back in the day when I was going to school in the 60s here in Daviess County, when unfortunately everybody was tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. And I can recall one day a law enforcement officer came in and spoke to us about the evils of all these psychedelics, the LSD and whatnot, and it was hailed as the worst of the worst, and it would it just couldn't get any worse than that. And then I got into law enforcement in the 70s, and the drug of choice at that time, the illicit drug of choice, was PCP, phencyclidine, and because of the violent occurrences associated with that drug, what did we in law enforcement do? We sold it as the worst of the worst. Moving on into the 80s, it was first powdered cocaine hydrochloride, and then later crack cocaine. Because all of the negativisms associated with that, it was hailed as the devil incarnate, and we in law enforcement said, this is the worst. Moving then into the new millennium, of course it was and continues to be methamphetamine, and I myself traveled across the country and talked about how this was the worst of the worst. So at some point, I think we lose our credibility, and people say, we become the proverbial little boy who cried wolf. The bottom line here is that all of these drugs are potential killers when utilized in a fashion or when abused. But the major makes an excellent point in terms of the message we send. We need to be real careful about what we're sending and how we're sending it.
Right. The particularly young people, when you tell them something and if they find it not to be true, you've lost them. You've lost them completely. Anything that you say after that, they're going to believe, well, they're just blowing smoke. Major, we hear about the overdose epidemic and the tremendous increase in death from overdose. And while we think about methamphetamine and heroin and marijuana, I think we often forget the opioids, the pills that are legal to be distributed by pharmacies, where people will get a handful of those. They'll take them, either that or some of the drugs that are coming from south of the border into our community that have been laced with fentanyl or something else to give them that little extra kick. Have you seen an uptick, an increase in overdose deaths and overdoses here in our community over the last couple of years?
Yes, and particularly in the past 8 or 9 months, and I'll kind of briefly talk you through the evolution. Not something that stood out to me, and I don't know if sheriff's office's numbers reflect, but our pill thefts in general is basically, when I worked narcotics, all the pill thefts were assigned to us, and you could kind of tell when it was time. It was either people that was abusing their pills, or somebody was.
Now, let me stop you a minute. Pill fest?
Thefts.
Thefts. Okay,
Yes,
I was either a festival
theft.
celebrating pills
Sorry,
or
Master,
okay, that's okay.
No, theft
Yes.
of medication,
Okay.
so controlled substances. Those numbers dropped significantly over the past 8 or 9 months for us. Now, what was picking up and what took their place, and I'm just theorizing here, but is when these fake Percocet 30s started showing up. And they started growing. We knew that they contained fentanyl, and it kind of evolved. At first, some of our overdoses were people thinking that they was getting legitimate Perc 30s and they was overdosing. Then it evolved to people purposely looking for the fake Perc 30s. And there was people that were intentionally overdosing on them. There was a black market that came around for Narcan, that knowing that they were going to overdose and could be administered Narcan by their friends or whoever that was around. I believe that the introduction of those fentanyl-laced pills actually reduced it. They kind of filled in the gap.
Okay.
To replace the prescription pills that were being used. Now, we have put a pretty good dent in that. We got up front on it, and we was doing specifically targeting those pills from the get-go as that was evolving. So I would say that the numbers will probably go back up when it comes to overdoses and abuse of prescription controlled substances, but only time will tell on that, sir.
You know, the a large majority of those folks who are in our county jail, who are in our state prisons, are there because of drug charges, substance abuse. What would you say to somebody who tells you that we ought to open the doors and let them all out? Or should we lock the doors, throw the key away? Or would you counsel folks that the majority of those people who are there are the distributors, they're not the end users? And in particular, what are we doing to avoid that here in our community? Such as, I know that if somebody is picked up and they have a joint in their pocket, they're written a ticket. They're not put in jail. They don't sit there waiting bond. They're given a court date and they go before the judge and they kind of handle it just like any other misdemeanor. So many people imply there's an implication out there that we throw them in jail immediately, and because they can't come up with a bail, they lay in jail for a while. Certainly anyone that's picked up in the city of Owensboro or Daviess County that goes to the jail until they are adjudicated by the state to be guilty of some felony, those folks are paid for on our dime, on the taxpayers' dime, on the dollars that you and our listeners and everybody else contribute in the form of taxes. So, I guess my question is, the people who are in jail in our state and federal prisons, are those the everyday users, or are those the guys who are out there distributing this stuff?
Well, the vast majority they're incarcerated on felony charges and have been convicted and are in our penal institutions certainly are the higher level, are individuals that are trafficking in these drugs. You've already alluded to the issue, and Major Winkler is probably better suited to address this issue because he's on the operational side of law enforcement more so than I. But I can tell you definitively that our officers, our deputies that encountered individuals with minute quantities of marijuana, those people are not being incarcerated. They're being cited because it is against the law in its current state, but they're being cited. They're not being incarcerated. Even those individuals trafficking in marijuana in minute or smaller quantities are routinely cited as opposed to being incarcerated. There are even some instances that I'm aware of individuals that are cooperating with investigation that are encountered on felony violations relative to drugs are cited as opposed. So from the initial contact with law enforcement, long before it makes its way into the judicial process, our officers are considering the fact: should this person be incarcerated, or is there another way to deal with this?
And Major, I'm assuming OPD takes that same vein, that same track. Really, you guys don't want to see anybody in jail any more than anybody else does. What we would like to see is that they rehab, become useful, productive citizens in our society, become good taxpayers.
There is a significant difference between someone who is addicted to a substance and an individual that's addicted to money and power. Right. And we recognize that. And it's I'll say my opinion is that drug addicts, somebody that's addicted to a controlled substance, they don't need to be incarcerated. That's just the long and short of it. Now, is there crimes sometimes that the addicts commit that create challenges? Burglaries, robberies, stuff to support their habits that may lead to that. But I think on a larger scale, that's kind of a failure of society to combat that underlying addiction, that underlying problem. But our focus, and I'll also go to this, we have to be careful to not shift so far that we're putting people that are addicted to money and power into rehab with these addicts, because it's the same difference as putting addicts in jail with the drug dealers. You're creating more opportunities for those dealers to victimize these addicts. You're creating a target-rich environment for them when they get out, and they're simply not addicted to controlled substance.
Right. So, again, and at some point I'm going to have Art Magdalene or Jailer Magdalene on to talk about the jail and what goes on there. But I know we have a substance abuse program in the jail to help folks who come in and who are addicted to drugs. Daviess County and the city of Owensboro passed a needle exchange so that we could try to control those diseases like hepatitis and HIV that are passed on by the multiple use of dirty needles. The city and the county jointly reinstituted a teen drug court to keep young folks out of jail. That we still have a senior drug court for those who are older than the teenage years, trying to help those folks. I know our judges in the judicial system would much rather send someone to rehab than to send them to jail, because as I said earlier, I think the jail becomes a training ground. It takes someone who really isn't criminal, who really is a good person, just went down the wrong path, and becomes a breeding ground for folks to just take another step into that abyss that we know is substance abuse. So I don't know what else we can do here locally as far as governments.
Well, we certainly can. This forum, this discussion wouldn't be inclusive if we didn't mention what is being done in terms of law enforcement working with the local coalitions that we have. The Drug Alliance, the local ASAP board. My chief deputy sits on the board of directors of ASAP. Owensboro Daviess County is blessed in terms of the recovery units that we have. There is much being done in terms of trying to assist these individuals that need that help. But we can't forget too that there's people are in jail for a reason, and that is to be held accountable for that which they have done that is unlawful. And we can't forget that. If you look at I think the studies indicate anywhere from 70 to 80+% of individuals incarcerated, both on the local and the state level, are associated with substance abuse. And many of those crimes are not just substance possession or even trafficking. It's domestic violence, it's sexual abuse, it's thefts, it's violent crime, all associated with substance abuse. So while certainly everyone wants to help these individuals, there are those individuals that find themselves afoul of the law that have to be held accountable for those actions.
Right. Well, I want to certainly thank Major Winkler and Sheriff Cain for coming on the air this morning. We must have done an excellent job, because I don't see any questions that have come in to us. I think it's a discussion that we need to continue to have in this community. I think that it's a discussion that needs to be had, particularly with those folks who are out there. They bash law enforcement, they bash the judicial system, and I don't think they really understand what's going on in their community. And you made a very good point. I continually see text and emails where we don't have enough rehab places in Owensboro and Daviess County, where we don't have enough places for those who are homeless because of their addiction, that we don't have enough help for them. And we have the help. We have the help. The problem a lot of times is trying to get those people to come in, get those people to say, I need the help. That's why I was so adamant about establishing the needle exchange. It gives me an opportunity, or those folks an opportunity, to talk to that individual in a non-threatening environment when they come in to exchange that needle, to see if they would like help. And it's amazing, sometimes that's all it takes.
Judge, and you mentioned, and maybe we ought to close where you started, and that's with this analogy on the war on drugs. A term that was actually coined during the Nixon administration. I continuously hear that we have lost the war on drugs. I take exception to that. We haven't lost the war on drugs because we continue to fight the war on drugs. It's ongoing and it's continuous, and we are engaged, the community's engaged. You know, this substance abuse issue is not a law enforcement phenomenon. It's a community problem. And if you believe that, then you've got to understand that the solution lies in the engagement and involvement of the community, and that's what you're talking about here. Much is being done. Have we lost battles in the war? Absolutely. But have we won battles? You sat there and talked about a number of initiatives. You talked about your brother who by the grace of God, overcame his addiction and became not only a contributing member of the community, but helped others in this problem. You look at the seizures that have been made as witnessed by what was done here a couple of months ago. All of those things are battles that are won in this war. We haven't lost the war on drugs because we continue to fight the war on drugs. And if you buy into that ideology, particularly those of us in law enforcement, it's akin to giving up. And that's something that law enforcement will never do.
I can tell you, give up is not something in my heart at all. Major, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I would, and that's just to kind of piggyback off what the sheriff said. You know, when we talk about addiction, the reality is, and we have to, as law enforcement, we have to adjust resources and you know, it's when it comes to addiction, how many resources is law enforcement going to spend on that, as opposed to combating the traffickers that are specifically targeting victims in our community. You know, this most recent case that we're talking about, I pulled up the hours, the manpower hours that was spent on that. OPD, we spent over 6,000 manpower hours from August through today's date. They're still working on it. Sheriff's Office put in 922 hours into it. I had to pull officers from patrol to support the detectives that were in there. During that time period, there were still 17,000 calls answered by us, 6,100 calls answered by Daviess County Sheriff's Office. We are diverting resources to combat this stuff, and we need to focus on the trafficking portion of this and not making addiction a law enforcement issue. Addiction, you know, there's the argument, is it a mental health condition? You know, I think that we need to start leaning towards that side of combating this from a medical perspective as opposed to a criminal justice perspective, to give us the resources, our limited resources, to put into combating the people that are coming into this community trying to victimize our community, sir.
Yeah, I agree with you, Major. From the very beginning years ago, the addiction is an illness. Addiction is an illness. Trafficking is not an illness. Trafficking is a business. And it's a business that is there to take money out of the pockets of those who least can afford it in our community. So with that, again, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I hope we can get together in the near future and do this again. I think it's something that the community for sure needs to hear, particularly from two experts.
Thank you for having us, Judge.
All right.